This is an extract from the Leader Coronavirus Daily podcast by the Evening Standard and hosted by me, David Marsland. To hear the whole thing, search for it on your podcast provider. What will London be like after lockdown? In the Evening Standard and online, you'll find the start of the newspaper's sustained reporting, looking at what happens when social isolation is lifted and how that could happen in the first place. Among those writing opinion pieces is Lord Heseltine, and he's with me over Zoom now. Lord Heseltine, in your time in government, was there ever anything that could compare to the scale of this coronavirus crisis?
Oh, no, nothing like this. There was the BSE crisis. I'll never forget the experience. Now, it never materialized on anything like the scale. But I remember the Monday afternoon, I was sitting in my office when the Minister of Agriculture, Douglas Hogg, phoned me and said, I need to talk to you. He came to my office and he said, look, we have this BSE problem. And the advice to me is that it may be containable, it may be of short-term nature, but on the other hand, nobody can rule out that it could be of pandemic scale. I greatly admire the speed with which he came to see me. I immediately picked up the phone to the Prime Minister, and the Cabinet met, I think, at 6 o'clock that day. The important thing was public confidence, because what we knew was very likely to become public in one way or another very rapidly. And so being in a position to answer the public's questions was paramount. And then putting out the information as quickly as possible was obviously very desirable. And I remember at the Cabinet meeting on the Monday, one of my colleagues asked a question, and if I remember something along the lines, does this have a particular threat to young people? To which the expert advice was, we don't know, and we won't know until, say, 48 hours. And I remember the trauma of thinking, oh my God, that question is so fundamental, we don't know the answer to it. And if we release this story that we have now, and that question is asked and we can't answer it, it has the ingredients of panic. So we decided to hold the news for 24 hours. We didn't have a leak. And so by the time we did actually reveal the information, we did have an answer to that very frightening question.
That line, I don't know, Minister, must be in some circumstances pretty terrifying when you're in the Cabinet. And there's so much about coronavirus that we don't know, isn't there?
Exactly right. And so what do you do as a minister? You're on the best advice that there is no certain answer. And if you then repeat that, and how can you avoid something of that sort, there are bound to be all sorts of reactions. Many of them are not comfortable. First of all, there'll be people all over the world who say, oh, yes, well, of course, we do know. And they'll get currency. They'll get the press listening to them. In fact, they may be talking complete rubbish and completely unsubstantiated arguments being advanced. That all goes with the game. And the coronavirus, it seems to me, full of examples of unanswerable questions.
But we are where we are now. Boris Johnson is now back as Prime Minister. There's a lot of pressure on him, on the Cabinet, to lift lockdown. If the government starts thinking about that, where does the government start?
I think that they should recognise that the pressure to come out is building inevitably, but their first responsibility is to avoid the risks that are so evident as part of that process, because those arguing most forcibly for opening up will be the first to turn on them if they open up too early. It's a very difficult choice they have to make. My instinct is to advise caution.
Can this country, though, ever be the same? When we come out of lockdown, will we just pop straight back into the UK as we knew it?
No, there's no chance of that. First, there is the fact that people are living on their savings. They are not earning anything like what they were, and they will be anxious to try and restore their own personal finances. Secondly, the corporate sector, our companies, are hemorrhaging cash, and they will be very cautious and very anxious to try and restore their cash reserves, their balance sheets. So whilst there'll be undoubtedly a sort of huge sense of relief immediately at the idea that the restrictions have been raised, the caution forced on by the economic circumstances will make sure, in my view, that we're in for a slow recovery process.
How slow, Lord Heseltine?
Well, nobody knows the answer to that question. That's the problem with so many of these dilemmas, that people are quite rightly asking the questions, but there are no scientifically demonstrable answers to these questions. That's very frustrating, particularly for the government, who knows that they're having to say that they themselves are going to make the best judgments, but there's a guesswork element in those judgments.
Search for the Leader Coronavirus Daily on any podcast provider to hear more from the podcast.